Our objectives today are to understand the definition and logic of Thurman's idea of mysticism. So we're going to talk a little bit about the definition, his definition, and the logic that's implicit in that definition. Okay. Second thing we're going to do, or the other objective we have, is to understand the caveats that are embedded in the logic of mysticism, to understand the experience of unity that mysticism creates, to understand, the fourth one, to understand mysticism's connection to social action as a form of ethical engagement. Okay. So understanding the definition and the logic, understanding the caveats that are embedded in the logic, understanding the experience of unity that mysticism creates, and then understanding the connection to social action as a form of ethical engagement. So I'm asking these kinds of questions. Am I mic'd? I am mic'd. How about I bring this a little bit closer to my, is that better? Okay. Perfect, thank you. So I'm answering about 4 different questions. We're answering the question today, why mysticism? That's the first question. Why mysticism? Okay. Second question, why this mysticism and not some other? Third question, what can mysticism and social action offer to religious practice? And then the fourth question, what does mysticism and social action offer to preaching? Okay? All right. For Thurman, the idea of mysticism is not just a term. It's not just a term, but a quality of experience. It's not just a term, but a quality of experience. More important to Thurman than the idea of mysticism are the implications of mysticism. In other words, mysticism has certain ends, teleological ends, we would say, that result in action. Mysticism has certain kinds of ends for Thurman that result in action. Mysticism has a particular ethical orientation. Now, Thurman will use the terms religious experience and mysticism interchangeably, okay? And I'll probably do a little bit of that today too. So, religious experience, mysticism, he's going to use those interchangeably. And I'll follow that same practice. But for the most part, they mean the same thing, okay? Religious experience, mysticism. We're gonna get there. Thurman defines religious experience as a kind of, and I quote, conscious and direct exposure of the individual to God. Okay? It's a one-line sort of definition, but you'll find this in lots of different places in his writing. Religious experience is defined as conscious and direct exposure of the individual to God. Okay? Before Thurman, and we talked a little bit about this 2 weeks ago, before Thurman had the language of mysticism, as a boy, he had the practice. Okay? There's an example in his autobiography on page 13 with Head and Heart, his autobiography with Head and Heart on page 13, that he witnessed a communion that existed between his grandmother and his mother so deep, and I quote, that there was never a discernible vibration of tension or anger between them. There must have been disagreements, he writes, but not an ounce of discord affected the climate of our home. And then, I've shared this before, when he was young, he found more companionship in nature. He has experiences of God near the river, the ocean, the oak, under the night sky. He writes about all of these experiences. So, again, before he had the formal language of mysticism, he had the practice, okay? In mysticism and social action, and our discussion today is really going to be grounded in this book. This is his book, Mysticism and Social Action. This is a book that is based upon his lecture in 1978, the Lawrence Lecture on Religion and Society. He gives this lecture, and in fact, our library, the Divinity Library, the Jean and Alexander Hurd Library, has a copy of this book. Okay, but in Mysticism and Social Action, he writes, "Long before I was acquainted with mysticism, and before such a category provided any frame of reference for my mind and thought, the line between the inner and the outer in my experience was not closely drawn." We'll begin to see more clearly later what he suggests here, that mysticism really transgresses, he learns this later, that it transgresses these boundaries of inner, and outer, of inner life and outer life. It transgresses these boundaries. I couldn't find this quote, but he writes about the hair shirt, right? He says that there's no need for the hair shirt. There's no need for self-flagellation, because a violent culture really resembles that. Okay? The hair shirt for Thurman is the violent culture that racism creates and maintains. Self-flagellation is not a part of his practice. The culture already does that for him. So, again, some of these ideas are really contributing to this argument that we've had all along, that who Thurman is contributes as much to his understanding of mysticism as his formal study and practice. Who he is contributes as much to mysticism as his formal study and practice. So I want to read to you from page 16 of this book. Okay. Thurman writes, "I have chosen to address myself to the subject of mysticism and social action for reasons that are both personal and crucial. Personal, because by the accident of birth, if indeed there are accidents in a fundamentally structured universe such as ours appears to be, conditioned me to be an outsider in the community of power where most of the life and death decisions are made which control the common life. If one refuses to accept the assigned category, it means a lifelong struggle for personal identity as well as one's own place in the total society. Always," he writes, "it has been urgent for me to validate beyond all ambivalences and all frustrations the integrity of my inner life. Due to the vicissitudes of the social situation in which I have been forced to live in American society, it has been vital for me to find within myself the door that no man can shut, to locate resources that are uniquely mine, to which I must be true if the personal enterprise of my life is to be sustained, despite the ravages inflicted upon it by society. To live under siege," he writes, "with the equilibrium and the tranquility of inner peace, to prevent the springs of my being from being polluted by the bitter waters that flow as drainage from the tablelands of violence and hatred. To do these two things in even the most limited and circumscribed way is to be strong enough to carry the heavy stones of the Spirit, which are necessary for the foundations of the kingdom of friendly men underneath a friendly sky. Of such is the ground for my personal statement and the implications of the theme I have chosen." So, here in this excerpt, we see I would name four, you may have seen others. Here we see at least four ideas, key ideas in his mysticism that will continue to show up in today's discussion. One, mysticism as an anathema to the misuse of power. in his phrase, refusing to accept the assigned category. So mysticism being a response to that. 2, mysticism as the validation of the inner life, when he writes, the door to which no man can shut. And 3, mysticism as a discipline, carrying the heavy stones of the spirit. You heard that in that excerpt. And then 4, mysticism as the grounds of social action. Okay, when he writes of the founding practice of an ethic of friendship, and we'll get to all of these. Okay, all right. So mysticism provides a kind of barrier or a screen, that blocks the human spirit from the violences of hatred in a society that is organized against particular kinds of people. For Thurman, mysticism is the shield perfectly gilded for those who live under siege. Mysticism affirms the place and the significance of persons in society where there exists radical depersonalization. Those are his words. I would use the term radical dehumanization. That's a more modern concept of this idea of individuals. Now, again, so to get at this idea, let's have a little bit of conversation for a second. And we don't have to reach very far into what we see happening in the news, some of the rhetoric that we hear every day. Here's a question. Where have you seen, and you can just, raise your hand, where have you seen dehumanization of individuals in society? Because this is what Thurman is speaking to, right? This is what Thurman is saying mysticism, right? This practice, these particular kinds of disciplines speaks to. So where does that show up in our, he writes this in 1978. Where does it show up for us today? Yeah, the dehumanization part. Yeah. I thought I heard somebody.
Separated from their parents.
Okay, right. Children being put in cages, separated from their parents at the border. All right.
I was going to say.
You said the same thing. Yeah. We see that. I mean, even the rhetoric around people being named animals or being characterized as animals. Right. Go ahead, please. Yeah.
And what he's doing to the Congress.
Yeah, okay.
Happening today.
Yeah. Can everyone hear? Do I need to repeat anything? Okay.
Okay. I was defrauded of my rightful inheritance and being human. This started in 1977. And I'm from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and I grew up on a multicultural street. So I've been exposed to several different cultures at one time.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm interpreting what you're saying through what I just said
Mm-hmm.
and how
Sure.
I see that.
Yeah, I mean, we can name tons of examples of what we see out there, out in the world. But many of us can name things that we've experienced ourselves. You yourself saying, I've experienced a thing that began, it's not just recent, it began decades ago, right? So we can name these examples. Go ahead, please.
And I think we know sometimes it's a system or it's just the environment. So I think about soldiers from World War II. If you were white, you could get a student loan and a home loan. If you were black, you could not.
Right.
When I was growing up here in Nashville and we would ride buses, I knew that who could sit at the front of the bus and who could sit in the back of the bus. And that taught everybody about dehumanizing it, but it didn't call it that.
Right. Exactly. Okay, that's
so you didn't even realize that somebody was teaching you something by that behavior, by that social acceptance, but it was happening just by getting on public transportation.
Yeah, sure. The world was sort of organized, and we still, again, we still in ways that we consent to and ways that we don't, participate in dehumanization. Yes, please.
And I think that women would know this best. The book, The Secret Life of an Unborn Child, by Dr. T. Barry Bassett, he said what happens after birth is a direct collaboration to what happens before birth. So I see this in reference to the inner meaning of life, the prenatal, and the outer meaning in reference to events. I see women as best being able to interpret that and to understand that.
Well, you're walking on shaky ground now, and we're not gonna sort of make arguments, because that could lead us down a road that I don't think and Thurman doesn't speak to this idea of life and prenatal and where it begins and whatnot. We're not going to go down that road, but I think we're safe in our common understanding of what dehumanization of full-grown folks looks like and feels like, and how it continues to manifest itself in the world today. Okay, and I think that's exactly what Thurman is also getting at. So, mysticism. Let me underscore the point. Mysticism also affirms the integrity of the person in the midst of the collective necessities of existence. This is Thurman's phrase. Mysticism affirms the integrity of the person in the midst of collective necessities of existence. In other words, mysticism is not just for survival, but solitude. Okay? Not just for survival, but solitude. He'll go on to write in Mysticism and Social Action, I'm going to quote, "There is within reach of every man or every person a defense against the grand invasion. A man can seek deliberately to explore the inner regions of his own life. He can grow in the experience of solitude, companioned by the minds and spirits of those who, as pilgrims of the lonely road, have left logs of their journey. He can become at home. This person can become at home within by locating in his own spirit the trysting place where he and his God may meet." Okay, so not just mysticism, again, this point of it not just being a tool of survival, but also a tool of solitude. And I love this phrase, where you can become at home within by locating in your own spirit the trysting place where you and your God may meet. I made that a little bit more personal, okay? All right, so I talked a little bit about caveats that are built into Thurman's understanding of mysticism. One, mysticism does not have the market on God. Okay? Mysticism does not have the market on God. Thurman would say, just because one might position oneself or have the open door or the open heart for a particular kind of encounter with God does not mean that one will experience God or the feeling that is created when one experiences God. There is no money-back guarantee. But the function of spiritual disciplines is to be ready, if perchance I am visited. Okay, that's a Thurman phrase. So you understand what he's saying there. Doesn't have a market on God, experience God. There's no guarantee that if you go to the same place every day and you posture yourself or you position yourself, that anything at all is going to happen. Okay? Thurman would say, but the discipline is to be ready, if perchance I am visited. So that's the first caveat. Number two, also the mystics claim to the mystic's claim to an experience is not beholden to or bound by empirical validation. In other words, if Mary comes to me, right, and claims that she has had a religious experience, I can take out my notebook and I can, begin to take notes, but it's not for me to take out my rubric to judge her claims against a common set of characteristics, okay? So there's a little bit of William James here, that the mystic is not beholden to empirical validation. So, there's not a list, there's not a rubric by which we judge what constitutes a mystical experience and what doesn't, okay? Instead, Thurman would argue that what the mystic experience is not merely a general truth or a truth in general, but rather a profound certainty that he is caught up in a vital experience of truth itself. That what the mystic experience is not merely a general truth or a truth in general, these are Thurman's words, but rather a profound certainty that he is caught up in a vital experience of truth itself. Now, I think that this point is connected to something that John Dewey says, okay? John Dewey actually writes and further sort of explains this idea, but writes in Art as Experience as whatever introduces genuine perspective is religious, okay? So we're getting at, let me say that again, whatever introduces genuine perspective is religious, right? So this is Thurman's thought, that the mystic doesn't experience merely a truth or truth in general, but a profound certainty. The certainty is that that the person has been caught up in the vital experience of truth itself. So there's an example on page 20 of this book that I'm just going to summarize. Basically, Thurman is talking about Quaker mystic George Fox, and says that, after he came down from that hill, that his claim on that experience was that all the world now had a new spell. All the world. A spell, S-P-E-L-L. All the world. Or, as in the spiritual, some of you know this, there's a spiritual that says, my feet look new and my hands did too when I came out of the wilderness leaning on the Lord. So it's that same kind of, you've had an experience, it might be difficult to name, inarticulable, right? Difficult to name, can't quite name it, but there is a newness about how you now experience self and how you now see the world. This is what Thurman is trying to get at, this vital experience of truth itself. Vital experience of having had some encounter, okay? And that encounter having a particular quality to it, and a particular ends to it, okay? Questions and comments? Yeah.
Might this be a way that you can enter into relationships and groups, but not lose your identity?
Say more, say more.
And that's a way to maintain your individual identity, but still stay in relationship.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Practice some sort of mystical practice.
Yeah,
Meditation,
right.
so that you connect with this.
I think what you're naming is that experience. It's almost like these two examples describe what the experience is like. So if I open myself up in the mystical experience to whatever may happen, to whatever encounter that I might experience of God, is the same kind of disposition or approach that I can have when I enter a new group, when I enter, a setting with new people or with friends, with strangers. If I have an openness to what may happen in that encounter, that in some ways those two different kinds of experience describe, sort of the depth of what Thurman is trying to get at here. I think that's a good example. The depth of, the possibility, right, that can occur when one is open to, I'm going to use his language, to this idea of the vitality of truth. What it means to experience perhaps someone else's truth for the very first time. And the change that is, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is that what you're trying to get at? No? Okay.
That's perfectly valid.
Okay. Well, say more then. I want to understand what you...
It seems like that the mystical experience gives you the opportunity to experience more profound truths. And in that more profound truths even about yourself. When you enter into social groups, churches, schools, neighborhoods, marriages, there's a tendency to conform to whatever that group has in mind, or whatever their purposes are. And there is a tendency, I think, to lose yourself in that.
Gotcha.
And so, to me, the mysticism practice, the meditation and whatnot, provides an opportunity for that not to happen. So that you still have your voice within that group, whatever it is.
Yeah, it's tricky because, when you do enter those groups and you've had that profound experience, that changes you a bit. It doesn't mean that you've lost yourself, but it does change you. There's a transformation that occurs.
And that's
So,
not necessarily bad.
yeah, right. Okay, good.
You have to find out whether it is or not.
Okay.
I'm lost.
Are you lost? Okay.
I am. I'm lost. I guess because from my teachings, my back long ago.
Yeah.
I think of mysticism in regard to holy people,
Yeah.
and I think of it only as a religious experience, experienced by yourself when you have almost like an out-of-body experience where you, but it's spiritual and you're lifted to a different level. That's all I think of. So I don't think of it, I think of it, it's difficult for me to see how it applies to interactions with other people.
Okay. I'm going to throw a term into the conversation then. Maybe this will help. Now, I'm also going to do this not to refute what you just said, because I would agree with you that, and Thurman would agree with you, that much of what the mystic does experience is through a solitary, meaning, it's an engagement of one with nature, with, some other perhaps inanimate object, but ultimately with God. But I would also argue, and I'm going to make that argument a little bit later, that it also comes through human interaction. The word that I'm going to throw into the pot is mediated. Mediated. And I don't argue this here. I didn't really intend to bring this up here. But, sort of one of the difficulties that we do have around this concept of mysticism is the very thing that you've named, okay? And there are folks, Amy Hollywood from Harvard Divinity, I think she's still there, writes on this idea. Stephen Katz, another person, writes on this idea that when we began to study mysticism across the board, right now we're just sort of looking at an idea of Christian mysticism. But let's just say we want to do a comparative study, and we want to put Christian mysticism up and against Jewish mysticism, perhaps Kabbalism. Maybe we want to also put it up against, Sufi ideas. And we want to look at all these things. Well, we want to say, well, folks are quick to rush to the idea that there is a common core in all mystical truth. Okay? Perhaps there is, but each one of those mystics have come to understand what it is that they've experienced through a mediated language. Does that make sense? Through the mediated language of their religious practice. Okay? If I'm a Christian mystic, I'm going to be using the language that I am most familiar with, that I was raised in, grew up in. These categories make sense to me, right? Same with these other groups that I've named. So this idea of mediation. Now, if we take it a step further, we can say that then if mystical experience is mediated through the tradition that we understand, that we were brought up with, then it's also, or can be, mediated through tools of that tradition. Okay? Thurman talks a lot, and I think I mentioned in maybe the very first class, talks a lot about the role of art. Okay? The role of art. You remember us talking a little bit about what was it called? The Vespers service, right? Where it was this beautiful Vespers service at Howard Divinity, and where he was the dean of the chapel. And the service was meant to, sort of to create a common language, a common experience, but a transcendent one. All mediated through these, historic representations of the Madonna. And he chose these young women, and they, it was the range of skin color and hair texture, and they, sort of posed replicating these ancient images, these ancient artworks. And what that service created with the music and these images and dance, one could say that those things mediated a particular kind. You might say, well, that wasn't mystical, that was religious. But again, we're trying to wrestle a little bit today with the encounter itself. Something like divine encounter that has as much to do with, the accoutrement, all the things that go into that, as it does the quality, the felt quality of that experience. So I would say that, there's some folks that can make the argument that they've had these encounters in the most unlikely of places. And I see hands, so I'm going to stop there for a second. So here and then here, okay?
In the tradition that I'm out of, we have an expression, something within you that you can't explain.
Yeah. Something within.
That you can't explain.
Yeah.
It's a reflection or echo, something beyond.
Yeah. Something within that you can't explain.
Exactly the word.
Yeah, but these phrases, they're all getting, they're pointing towards something similar. Now
Thinking about prisoners. And
Yeah.
When you talk about dehumanization,
Yeah.
very little society is dehumanizing, I would think, as being in prison.
Mm-hmm.
And many of them over there have had a lifetime.
Can't hear what
I'm talking
Okay.
about prisoners and just the isolation, and there's so much, when I think about meditation, sometimes it's like, I would really like to do more of that, but I don't find the time in my day.
Yeah.
It's a matter of discipline and take on, but when you're in prison, you've got nothing but time.
Mhm.
So much empty space, and it just seems like it would be, from the way that you're describing it,
Mhm.
it would seem very healing and a way to tolerate a long period of cut off from everything else. But I don't know what the experience
Yeah.
has been as far as introducing that in prisons.
I mean, that's interesting. I think on one level, yes. On one level, in environments that are not the typically violent environment of a prison, I think many prisons that we could name are characterized now as being some of the most violent places on earth. And we've structured, I'm going to say we because in some ways, sort of we have public responsibility for how we do criminal justice and public responsibility for ultimately the environments of the violent environment. So I want to say yes, and I think, when you think about some of the letters that we have of folks that have written from prison or from jail, you think about King's letter from a Birmingham jail. There's an opportunity there. He doesn't name that experience as, particularly religious, but the letter from the Birmingham jail that we have that yielded it's a kind of a contemplative letter. It's indicting of the church. So I could go with you there. I would be hesitant to name prison as a particular kind of place that would produce just because of the violent culture that exists there.
As you were saying earlier, that's a way of
Yeah.
escaping it and that's a response to it. Not that it typically produces.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
It doesn't.
Yeah.
I think, but
Yeah.
it's a way if it could be just
Yeah.
taught and introduced.
Oh, if it can be taught there. Yeah.
People come.
It's an interesting. Yeah. It's an interesting question. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
I've shared, I think, this experience with you that several years ago, my husband was involved in a serious crime where his car was stolen and a gun was put to his head. And a couple of years later, I was able to participate in the restorative justice session with him and members of his family. And I have always referred to it as a time where I said it was like God, we were all speaking what God wanted us to hear. But you having said this today, it was more than that. And I think it was a mystical experience that could only happen because we had built on these moments. During those couple of years, I did a lot of reading from Henry Nouwen. And what you're ready to do, and then the opportunity to do it. I also, when you said mediation, it was so important in that experience that we had mediators there that guided us through. It wasn't a time to seek justice. It was a time to seek each other and see each other in the humanity that we had. But I also think the humanity that we have with a spiritual being had to be there. So I would never before, 5 minutes ago, thought that I truly had a mystical experience, but now I think that that was. So thank you.
That's good. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
In order to forgive, in order to forgive someone, do you need to have a mystical experience? I mean, do you have to sort of go outside yourself to truly forgive someone who's done something awful to you? In order to forgive them, and I know you ask God to help you, but to truly forgive, do you need to have a mystical experience? Grace?
I would. What do you say?
I vacillate back and forth because I'm trying to forgive someone right now. And that's why I'm bringing this up. And I try to go to my higher power and listen and then talk back to me, whatever. And it's just not happening.
Yeah.
I mean, I try to go on and pretend that it never happened, but it did. And guess that's what I'm trying to, as you're saying about mysticism and spiritual, I guess I need to go
Yeah.
inside myself, to go outside myself.
I think that's that's a really difficult question. And I want to answer it through Thurman's eyes. And we can talk after class if you want Amy's opinion, okay? And we're going to get to that because, ultimately these two, your question, I haven't left it entirely. These two examples are the more difficult examples that we hold up against this theory. It's almost like saying, all right, if I'm gonna track with you, if I'm gonna follow what you're saying, Mr. Thurman, Dr. Thurman, then will this hold up? Will these ideas hold up in real life? Will these ideas hold up for me in an experience, a violent, I'm going to go back to, I don't know, you haven't named your experience, but we experience all kinds of violences, that could be verbal and whatnot, so forth. But do they hold up? And Thurman, I think, would say, yes, religion in particular is especially important for the ordinary difficulties of life. And I'm going to say that because, again, like I said, he doesn't write as the Desert Fathers, wrote, who were separated from the world and sort of maintained their lives on a perch in the desert and had very little interaction. Not that I'm degrading, downgrading that or downplaying it. But Thurman's, his theory, he's wrestling this theory out of the stuff of his life. And so I would argue that it is absolutely these are the tools for forgiveness. These are the tools for, you mentioned the word restorative justice. Again, I'm wrestling with the prison. These are the tools. Now, do those things require a whole mystical experience? Well, I'm going to get to this point a little bit later, and maybe I should jump there now. Because ultimately, what Thurman is arguing is that in the sitting along with self and God, there are a couple of things that happen. Yes, you sort of tutor, the spirit is disciplined for a deeper kind of listening, a deeper kind of knowing. The spirit is tutored in that way. He would also say that in sitting long enough with self, and I'll see if I can find it because there's a phrase in this book, but in sitting long with oneself, if I sit long enough with self, that in my sitting with self and in my looking into myself, that looking far enough and deep enough, I end up finding you. He would say that you end up finding the other. How does that contribute to these ideas? Well, for me, there's a word that speaks to this kind of ontology, this logic, and the word is empathy. That's not the only ingredient of forgiveness, I would argue. But that, that's a significant one. that looking long enough into self, one finds, these ideas of the other. We're going to get to that more explicitly here in just a minute. Okay, or maybe, actually, here we are. All right, so for Thurman, mystical experience may not be accountable to empirical standards, but there are qualitative expectations. Those expectations affect the totality of how one understands the world and its unity. I think Thurman would say that if I sit long enough and make a habit of this sitting, that one day what will emerge in my consciousness is that if I look long enough at myself, deep into my own idiom, that's one of his phrases, deep into my own idiom, far enough into my own experience, what I eventually find is not only myself, but the other, all others in the unity of a whole. I sense in myself that creation has but one breath. And as I breathe, the whole creation breathes. And this is really our turn towards the ethical. You've moved us there. Okay, y'all have moved us there with these examples, these very fine examples. We're now turning, right? Making this turn. I'm going to read a little bit to you, okay? So page 21, if anybody's taking notes, you're going to get the book later. He says this: social action, therefore, is an expression of resistance against whatever tends to or separates one from the experience of God. I'll read that again. Social action, therefore, is an expression of resistance against whatever tends to or separates one from the experience of God, who is the very ground of his being. He says this is where I'm coming out. Here, the concern is not with the particular creed, doctrine, or dogma. The mystic is not fundamentally concerned with such categories. He sees clearly that all such categories are definitions of the mind. They reflect the teaching, the cultural patterns, the particular social orientation of the individual. They represent what the mind does when it seeks to rationalize the profound experiences of the spirit. They are what the mind distills from the ceaseless ferment of the ebb and flow of the fluidity of experiences as life is being lived. They do not represent the truth of what one experiences. Such is only necessary when one undertakes to talk about it, to explain what one experiences of the truth. Therefore, the mystic's concern with the imperative of social action is not merely to improve the conditions of society. It's not merely to feed the hungry, not merely to relieve human suffering and human misery. If this were all, in and of itself, it would be important, surely, but this is not all. The basic consideration has to do with the removal of all that prevents God from coming to himself in the life of the individual. Whatever there is that blocks this calls for action. Okay, and I'm going to stop there. All right. Elle, you are on the edge of your seat.
Well, no, I'm on the edge of my seat because my back is.
Oh, okay. There's a difference. There's a difference. I know. I was like, oh, what is it?
I stand up and say hallelujah. But really, I did respond to this one thing in what he said, which was whatever separates us from God.
Yeah.
Which in my church was the definition of sin.
Yeah. Right.
You know, so I mean, really, that phrase, that's exactly the
Yeah,
phrase.
yeah.
I mean, so I was thinking, that's a new thought for me. Social action is the resistance against whatever separates us from God. So
Yeah.
all that stuff is sin.
Yeah.
In a way, you know. But anyway, I like that very much.
Okay,
I didn't
good.
have me on the edge of my seat, sorry.
There could be misinterpretations here. All right. Okay.
And can I?
Yes, please. Yeah.
One of the challenges that was brought up was the issue of forgiveness.
Yeah.
And when you said when you look deep inside yourself enough, you find the other person. So we're all, fallible. We're all human and have spiritual beings, have to me expresses is the fact that we are all of the same seed. We are all brothers and sisters, and we all share the same valuableness. So if you go deep, deep, deep down within yourself enough, you'll find a way to forgive, someone who may have done you wrong, and then be okay with it. The other point earlier you made when you were talking about this earth or this world being polluted by the bitter waters that flood. This being Earth Day weekend.
Yeah.
Is that the waters are, they're everywhere. They're all around us, and we have to be the filtration system that cleans it up.
Yeah. I'm wrestling with this idea of forgiveness because I think knowing what you just said, we can know that we are a part of a human family. And, we can know that all of us are infallible, and yet still find it extremely difficult to forgive. So I'm wrestling with the quality of forgiveness that I think you're after. Because I think, go ahead, please. I'm not going to.
And I find when I'm to a certain point of understanding and forgiveness, the anger comes back and smacks me right in the face.
Yeah.
So, and then everything is all lost and you have to start all over again. So what does Thurman say of mysticism, anger? Is there anything in his teachings that...
That's a really good question. I don't recall. He deals primarily with the structure. Let me see if I can walk my way into it, and you can help me too, okay? He deals with these structures that create, for instance, in The Luminous Darkness, right, which is a book about segregation.
What's it called?
The Luminous Darkness. Luminous. He deals with the structures that create, to use Elle's words, these sort of these sinful divisions and separations. I'm thinking in Jesus and the Disinherited, he talks about, he does talk about hatred in Jesus and the Disinherited. He does. And fear and deception. Go ahead. Help us out with this question.
Being a naturalist like Thurman, being close to Earth, thinking about all his love for the planet, the trees, the beach, sand, I wouldn't think that anger exists in the natural world. And we're trying to sort of biomimic ourselves in a way. And so while there is violence in the natural world, lightning will strike a tree, tornadoes will come and but I don't think that there's anger involved in that. I think it's more like accepting it as it is and moving on and starting to grow again. So, that spiritual connection you have with sitting at a tree or sitting on the beach helps you understand that, and it goes back to our fallibleness as humans. We go deep enough and we try to be like nature, and we hug those trees and we try to get what they have from them into us. I think that's a solution.
Okay. Thank you. Yes.
I remember once I forgot a very important appointment, and the person called me, and they said, I forgive you. And I told the lady, I said, first, I've got to go forgive myself for why I forgot such an important appointment. So what I'm saying is, there is a self-forgiveness. If we don't know how to forgive ourselves or have not forgiven ourselves for anything, it's difficult to try to find ways to do it.
Now, let me ask you, I'm gonna press you a little bit on this point, because is self-forgiveness a part of this, the scenario that she's described? Because the scenario that she's describing, you know, I don't want to read into it, but is self-forgiveness a part of her scenario?
Well, she just said something like, I heard something like that. But I'm not sure about all I know is when I think of forgiving self, I think of myself and how I think about it. And I remember it was in the book by Amy Steele about damaged emotions. And that's where I got that thinking from. But I have had the experience of just simply having an experience where someone forgave me of something that I was not able to receive for how it had affected me forgetting something that was so important. I had to go find out why I forgot that. Then I could accept. Forgive myself, then I could accept it.
Okay, we've got some insight over here from the east.
Our problem is in the definition of forgiveness being forgetting. That I don't think those items equate those two necessarily. I know nothing about Thurman other than what I'm learning from you. So, however, Oprah, who probably did learn from Thurman, I think that there's another definition for forgiveness, which is it's actually getting to the place where you stop wishing it hadn't happened, which is sort of, it's you don't forget it. It's just like it's no longer affecting your life. It's you've moved on. You've left it. You're not using your energy on it.
Okay. All right.
That's what Dr. Thurman would say, don't you think?
Absolutely.
I thought
Mediated by Dr.
That's right. We're going to come back to this because I don't think it's settled, though. I think all of these answers have contributed to our mutual learning, but I think there is still something, and I'm not merely doing this as a ploy of my pedagogy. But I am saying I think that there is something there to your question that I'm perhaps can't get to today. Okay. But it is interesting that that you're holding in tension. I don't want to just skip because it is interesting that you're holding in tension these practices as an individual, and then our practices as social action, like collective social action, because that's where we were headed. Collective social action. Thurman talks about the boycott, talks about these tools and methodologies of nonviolent protests and the like that we're familiar with. You've kind of turned us back to say, well, if these practices are good enough for social action in terms of, collective social action, then what do they ultimately mean upon our individual practices, right? That's where we are now. Did y'all hear that question and the tension between? That's where we are. And we've had some insight from our class. Yeah.
I would say spiritually, one of the things that I didn't learn to do until the last few years was as well, all of a sudden going, okay, so if I'm a Catholic, so if I believe that Jesus is there and it's after the Holy Thursday dinner and he's in the garden and he's accepting all of this, but sometimes I have to give it to him. That he is still waiting in that garden for me to give up and go to him and say, I can't do this by myself. I want to share it with you. And it's been amazing those times that I have this clarity of, he's in the garden and I can actually reduce his suffering if I give it to him because we're going to share it, and it's an intentional thing. And that is helpful, and I could not have done that 10 years ago because every day we have an opportunity, and I think this is part of Thurman, I'm not sure.
No.
Every day you have an opportunity to practice it, to grow in it, and that you have to. My father died 10 years before I got married. It was not news to me that he was dead. But on the day that I'm getting ready to go down the aisle, I'm going, oh, Daddy's not here. And I hadn't had that chance to grieve that part of him. And I think the same thing is true for forgiveness or anger, that sometimes it's the same thing and we think, oh, I got rid of that. But no, we have to practice the spiritualness every time it comes up. And I think that Thurman's also saying, though, if you can keep practicing it, it will be there stronger for you.
I'm going to agree with that. I think you're very close to where I want to go. I'm going to mention something else and then we'll get to you. In the very first meditation that he writes in Meditations of the Heart, this is another small book of just short meditations, right? The very first meditation, you have that with you? No. Very first meditation, Thurman talks about each person having an internal island. I'm paraphrasing, trying to get at the core idea here. An island. On this island are two angels with flaming swords. Basically, the idea is that nothing can get past these swords without your consent. Okay? So that's sort of the first thing I want to, and this is actually when you first started, this reminded me. That again, in a sense, these ideas, remember, it's sort of going back to this idea that mysticism is a barrier and a screen. These angels with the flaming swords, again, is another metaphor of this idea of mysticism being a screen. That, when you have loved and you have suffered from having been disappointed or being hurt or whatever, and there's this suffering. We have given that consent over. I would suggest that, again, that forgiveness is a process. I'm going to agree with you there. I don't know how he would say this other than to say that it is a part of our daily discipline in our interactions with humans, that we be in this process of understanding and empathy and forgiveness, not without accountability. And these are not his words, but these are my words, not without accountability. But that we're in this process, that part of the ebb and flow of our relationality with ourselves, to your point, and with others is this idea that we are constantly in process. Because we're in process and we're learning and we're changing and transforming, and we're hurting people as much as we are being hurt, right? That we are at least open. And I want to return to the open, because the opening, because someone had the question, well, do I have, does it take a mystical experience for me to be able to forgive? Maybe. Is what I would say is maybe. Honestly, maybe. Maybe it takes that willingness to be open, that one's eyes can see what one couldn't see on one's own. That suddenly one can grasp what hasn't been grasped. Is that a word, graspable? One hasn't been able to grasp rationally, right? Through the powers of our mind, that if I'm open to the idea that mysticism is even possible. If I'm not open to the idea, then forget it. But if I am open to the idea that I can encounter the divine, then I would entrust, and I guess, I would say that really Thurman's whole life is this statement. It's a statement of trust that if I believe I'm open to this, that opening, it's almost like currency for whatever I experience. It's a particular kind of spiritual currency. That bypasses or may bypass or may help us to rationally explain things. Thurman reminds us that the mind is young. The idea of mind it's young. Thank you. Okay. All right. So we were going to move to the sermon, but I think what I want to do as sort of our last thing, the last thing that we'll move to, and I think this will help us kind of seal there's a letter here, an essay called Finding God, and this essay is out of volume 1 of the Howard Thurman Papers Project, okay? And these volumes were published by South Carolina Press. Walter Fluker is the editor. Now, I knew that that the idea of mysticism is one that we probably would not be able to just, settle in one day. That's fine. There's lots to be said. But I want us to quickly, and we don't have time, folks, so if you're going to volunteer, volunteer. If not, then we'll just read it silently together. But I'm going to start reading, and then if we have 3 or 4 volunteers to read, help me read, then we'll do that. But this is Finding God. Finding God appeared in 1927 as a chapter in Religion on the Campus, a collection of essays presented at the annual National Student Conference of the YMCA, Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. This article strikes the characteristic theme that would appear in many of Thurman's writings in the late 20s, that there is no division between God and human experience, and to partake of the unity of God would lead men and women into a community with one another. I'm just going to start. I'm tired of sailing my little boat far inside the harbor bar. I want to go out where the big ships float, out on the deep where the great ones are. And should my frail craft prove too slight for storms that sweep those billows o'er, I'd rather go down in the stirring fight than drowse to death by the sheltered shore. Students of this generation are protesting in telling fashion against the bondage of formula. Yet almost in the same breath, there comes a series of questions. Tell me exactly how I can find it. Outline for me the steps. Point out for me the way along which I must go if I may find that for which my heart hungers. And out of the heart of life, I seem to hear a voice which says, no one can give to you the answer to your questions. You must live into that answer. As for myself, I seem to be as a child who walks along the seashore, admiring the pretty pebbles scattered here and there, while the vast ocean of truth stretches out before him, boundless and unexplored. I seem to catch up in my own experience the words of Tennyson, but what am I? An infant crying in the night, an infant crying for the light with no language but a cry? What I shall say to you, therefore, this morning is but a confession of faith and a sense of direction toward which, when I am not myself, I seem to go. The quest for fulfillment is perhaps the most real quest in all the world. When the Latin poet Horace says that he was not able to sleep because of the pressure of unwritten poetry, when Bunyan tells us in his prologue that he had to put aside the work that he was doing on some sermons and other serious tracts in order to write Pilgrim's Progress, when Walter Hampden says that he had to play Hamlet in order to keep a contract with his soul, when a reviewer writes about a concert in which Paderewski gave his 5 years dip into politics, I'm confident that I'm not listening to a musician who is attempting to play a tune, but I'm in the presence of a great Catholic spirit which somehow is trying to express itself in a strange, mighty combination of rhythm and tone. When another critic writing about Roland Hayes says, when I hear him sing, I know that I am sitting in the presence of one who sings because he must. When Ulysses says, I am part of all that I have met, yet all experience is an arch, wherethrough gleams that untraveiled world, where margin fades forever and forever as I move. When the Apostle Paul says, woe is me if I preach not the gospel. Or when Jesus of Nazareth on that memorial morning in Palestine says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. All of these, each in his own way, is expressing the inner urge which drives him on, and he has no choice but to go. And it may be that the quest for fulfillment is the quest for God. And it may be that when I have found that for which my heart hungers, I have found him. We have listened from this platform to words which point out essentially the ground or the affirmation which Jesus of Nazareth made about God. We have heard it affirmed that it was his faith and the faith of the speakers that at the heart of this universe there is personality, which is at once the source of life and the goal of life. If that affirmation is valid, then a series of things must follow therefrom, and it is along the line of these that I think the quest for fulfillment, the quest of God, drives one. Okay, where are we on time? We're at time. I'm going to skip to the very last paragraph, and in there, finding God, finding fulfillment in a world like this, I must have demands within myself for the kind of energy that God releases, and that energy must be with reverence to a need which calls it forth, and which will not let me rest until I find it. This is what Jesus is thinking about, I believe, when he says, you are to be congratulated if you feel a deep sense of moral and spiritual inadequacy, for yours is the kingdom, the rule, the presence of God. Jesus stands with a patient and quiet smile at the gates of the 20th century, waiting till this lagging student generation catch up with him. Then he will lead the tired and the famishing into his city of love. So, all right, so we end it here. So this is, we're just dancing. We did a two-step today around this idea of mysticism, what that means, the impact it has upon social action and social collective action. And we will continue to wrestle with this idea of what it means upon individual relationality. And next week, we will look more purposefully at the sermons and look and see where is mysticism now? Where is mysticism and where is ethics in his preaching? All right, so that's what we'll do next week. Thank you.
I have a brief announcement.